The dust swirled like a demon's breath across the sun-baked Montana street as Josephine Sinclair stepped down from the stagecoach, her gloved hand clutching a worn leather satchel that contained her future, a contract that had brought her 2,000 miles from Boston to this frontier town called Whitetail Creek in the summer of 1873. Her other hand trembled so badly she had to press it against her traveling skirt to still the motion, the tremors betraying the confidence she'd worked so hard to project. "Last stop, Whitetail Creek," the driver called, tossing down her trunk with little ceremony. Josephine surveyed the ramshackle main street with its weathered buildings and hitching posts. This was nothing like the Boston she'd left behind, with its cobblestone streets and brick facades. Here, the buildings seemed to lean drunkenly against each other, as if the very weight of the vast sky above might crush them. "Miss, you need assistance," a voice called, and Josephine turned to see a young boy of perhaps 12 eyeing her trunk. "Yes, please." "I need to find my way to the Quinn Ranch." The boy's eyes widened. "That's a fair piece out of town, madam. You'll need a wagon or horse." Josephine nodded. "Then first, I need a place to stay until I can arrange transportation." "The Western Star's your only choice," he said, pointing to a 2-story building with peeling paint. "Mrs. O'Malley runs it proper-like." She paid the boy a penny to help with her trunk, then trudged through ankle-deep dust toward the boarding house. Boston seemed like another lifetime, another world entirely, and perhaps it was. Josephine had nothing left for her there, not after her father's gambling debts had swallowed their home and his subsequent death had left her destitute. The advertisement in the matrimonial news had been her salvation, a rancher in Montana Territory seeking a wife, Garrett Quinn. She'd never laid eyes on him, but his letters over the past 6 months had been kind, if somewhat brief. "A man of few words," he'd explained. The contract in her satchel outlined the arrangement: marriage, partnership in the ranch, and in return, she would keep his home and bear his children. Practical, sensible. But now that she was here, the reality of marrying a stranger made her stomach twist into knots. Mrs. O'Malley proved to be a robust woman with Irish lilt still clinging to her words despite decades in America. She showed Josephine to a small but clean room and promised to inquire about transportation to the Quinn Ranch first thing in the morning. "Quinn's a good man, Mrs. O'Malley said, fluffing a pillow. "Keeps to himself mostly, but honest as the day is long. His brother was the talker of the family." "Was?" Josephine asked. "Died 2 years back. Fever took him. Garrett's been alone out there since, except for his ranch hands." That night, Josephine could barely sleep. She took out the contract and read it again by lamplight, her fingers tracing the neat script her future laid out in precise terms. There was nothing romantic about it, but romance was a luxury she couldn't afford. Security was what mattered now. The next morning, Mrs. O'Malley's breakfast of eggs and biscuits sat heavily in Josephine's stomach as she waited in the parlor, her trunk packed and ready beside her. A wagon was arranged to take her to the Quinn Ranch, and she couldn't decide if the flutter in her chest was anticipation or dread. "That'll be him now," Mrs. O'Malley said as the sound of horse hooves and wagon wheels creaked to a stop outside. Josephine expected the driver Mrs. O'Malley had arranged, perhaps one of the local men from town. Instead, when she stepped onto the porch, she found herself looking up at a tall man with broad shoulders, his face partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson. He stepped down from the wagon with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Miss Sinclair." His voice was deep, a hint of gravel beneath the surface. "Yes," she answered, unable to say more as he removed his hat, revealing sun-weathered features and the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever encountered. "Garrett Quinn. Thought I'd come fetch you myself." This was him, the man she'd agreed to marry. No photograph had been exchanged, only letters. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30, with a strong jawline partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard. There was a hardness to him, like the land he worked, but something in his eyes softened as he looked at her. "I appreciate that, Mr. Quinn," she managed, her mouth suddenly dry. He loaded her trunk into the wagon with ease, then helped her up onto the seat. His hands were calloused but gentle, and something peculiar happened in Josephine's chest when they touched a flutter that had nothing to do with nervousness. The journey to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon jostling over uneven terrain. Garrett Quinn wasn't much for conversation, it seemed. He answered her questions about the land and the ranch in terse sentences, his eyes scanning the horizon as if always looking for some unseen threat. "Beautiful country," she ventured, taking in the vast expanse of prairie that gave way to distant mountains. "It can kill you if you're not careful," he replied, but then his expression softened. "But yes, there's nothing like it anywhere else." As they crested a rise, Josephine caught her first glimpse of the Quinn Ranch, a sprawling property nestled in a valley with a substantial log home, several outbuildings, and corrals filled with horses. A creek wound through the property, cottonwoods marking its path like sentinels. "It's lovely," she breathed, something that might have been pride flickered across his face. "Been in the family for 20 years. My pa built the main house, added onto it when my brother and I got older." When they pulled up to the house, a woman emerged from the doorway, gray-haired and thin, with kind eyes. "That's Mrs. Hatcher," Garrett explained. "Comes from town 3 days a week to cook and clean. Thought it might be good to have her here when you arrived." Josephine appreciated the thoughtfulness. At least she wouldn't be immediately alone with this stranger she was meant to marry. Mrs. Hatcher welcomed her warmly, showing her to a room that would be her own until the wedding, the older woman said with a knowing smile that made Josephine blush. "Mr. Quinn said to tell you he'll be at the stables if you need anything," Mrs. Hatcher added once they were inside. "Dinner's at 6 sharp." Left alone, Josephine unpacked her meager belongings and sat on the edge of the bed, removing the contract from her satchel once more. The paper felt heavier somehow, now that she'd met the man whose name was signed at the bottom. She traced his signature with her fingertip, wondering what kind of husband Garrett Quinn would be. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair. Mrs. Hatcher served a hearty stew with freshly baked bread, then excused herself to return to town with one of the ranch hands. Josephine found herself alone with Garrett at the large oak table that could easily seat 10. "Mrs. Hatcher's a fine cook," she said, desperate to break the silence. "She is," he agreed, then cleared his throat. "I hope your room is satisfactory." "Very much so. The entire house is lovely," he nodded, seeming as uncomfortable as she felt. Finally, he set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "I imagine you have questions." Josephine took a deep breath. "I do. I thought perhaps we might discuss the terms of our arrangement." Something flickered in his eyes, discomfort, perhaps. "Terms?" She reached into her pocket where she'd placed the folded contract. "Yes, I brought the contract with me. I thought we might review it together, make any necessary adjustments before the wedding." His expression darkened. "Contract?" "Yes, the one we've been corresponding about these past months, the marriage arrangement." Garrett pushed his chair back and stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the darkening ranch yard. "I'd hoped." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You'd hoped what, Mr. Quinn?" "That there might be more to bringing you here than just a business arrangement." He turned to face her, his expression pained. "My brother was always the one good with words. He helped me write those letters." Josephine's heart sank. "Your brother who died?" "Yes, Thomas. He said no woman would come all this way based on what I could write on my own." Garrett ran a hand through his hair. "But he made me promise that if I found someone, I'd speak from the heart, not from some paper with terms like I was buying cattle." Josephine stood, clutching the contract. "I don't understand. You agreed to these terms in your letters." "I agreed to marriage, yes, to partnership, but not like that." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and held out his hand. "Let me see it." With trembling fingers, she handed him the contract. His eyes scanned it briefly before his jaw tightened. Without warning, he tore it in half, then quarters. "Mr. Quinn," she gasped. "Garrett," he corrected, letting the pieces fall to the table. "If you're to be my wife, at least use my given name. How dare you?" Indignation flared within her. That contract was my security, my protection. Protection from what? Me? His voice rose slightly. You think I need a piece of paper to tell me how to treat my wife? I don't know you, she cried. How am I to know what kind of man you are? That contract ensured I wouldn't be left with nothing if this arrangement didn't suit you. His expression softened then, understanding dawning in his eyes. You've been hurt before. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. My father's debts left me with nothing. I was forced from my home with nowhere to go. Garrett nodded slowly. I'm sorry for that, truly. He gestured to the torn paper. But I don't want a wife bound to me by ink on paper. I want a partner who stays because she chooses to, day after day. His words struck something deep within her, a longing she'd buried beneath practicality and survival. That's a lovely sentiment, but sentiments don't feed or clothe a person. No, hard work does that, he agreed, and this ranch has plenty of that to go around. He took a step closer to her, close enough that she could smell the leather and pine scent of him. I'm offering something better than a contract, Josephine. And what is that? Myself, this ranch, a real life, not just an arrangement. His voice dropped lower. I may not be good with fancy words, but I know what it means to honor a commitment. You won't need a contract to hold me to that. Josephine stared at him, this man she'd traveled so far to marry, realizing she knew nothing about him beyond the carefully penned letters she now knew that weren't entirely his own. How am I supposed to trust that? Get to know me, he said simply. We don't have to marry tomorrow. Stay, work alongside me, see what kind of man I am, then decide. And if I decide this isn't what I want, then I'll personally escort you back to Boston or wherever you wish to go with enough money to start fresh. He held her gaze steadily. I want a wife, Josephine, not a prisoner. Something in his earnest expression made her believe him, despite her better judgment. A trial period then, the corner of his mouth lifted, if you want to call it that. How long? A month. That should be long enough to see if we suit. Josephine considered the proposal. She had no home to return to, and the money she'd brought would barely get her a week's lodging elsewhere. Very well, Mr. Garrett, 1 month. The smile that spread across his face transformed him, softening the hard angles and lighting his eyes. Good, we start tomorrow. The next morning dawned bright and early on the Quinn ranch, with Josephine waking to the unfamiliar sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and ranch hands calling to one another as they began their day's work. She dressed in her most practical skirt and blouse, uncertain what the day would bring. Garrett was already at the breakfast table when she descended, a cup of coffee in hand and papers spread before him. Good morning, he said, standing when she entered. Sleep well? Well enough, thank you. She accepted the cup of coffee he poured for her. I thought you might want to see the ranch today, get your bearings. And so began Josephine's education in ranch life. Over the next several days, Garrett showed her every aspect of the operation, from the cattle herds to the vegetable garden behind the house, from the stables to the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. She learned that Garrett had 8 men working for him full-time, with more brought on during roundup season. The ranch raised primarily cattle, but had a respectable horse breeding program as well. It was larger and more prosperous than she'd imagined from his modest letters. My father started with just 50 acres and 20 head of cattle, Garrett explained as they rode along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property. Now we have over 2,000 acres and several hundred head. Josephine had never ridden astride before coming west, but Garrett had been patient in teaching her, his hands steady as he'd shown her how to mount and control her horse, a gentle mare named Daisy. It's impressive what your family has built, she said sincerely. It hasn't been easy. This land takes as much as it gives sometimes. His expression grew distant. Lost my mother to pneumonia when I was 14, Pa 5 years later when a bull gored him, then Thomas to fever. I'm sorry, she said softly. It seems you've lost a great deal. He nodded once, then turned to her with unexpected vulnerability in his eyes. It's why I wrote that advertisement. The ranch needs a future, children to pass it to someday. The directness of his statement made her blush, but she appreciated his honesty. I understand. As the days passed, Josephine found herself settling into a routine. She helped Mrs. Hatcher with cooking and household management on the days the older woman came, and on other days, she took over those duties herself. She started a small herb garden near the kitchen door and reorganized the pantry, finding satisfaction in bringing order to the bachelor household. Garrett, she discovered, was a man of action rather than words. He rarely spoke of feelings or intentions, but his actions revealed much about his character. He was fair with his men, generous with neighbors in need, and unfailingly respectful toward her. One evening, about 2 weeks into her stay, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. My mother used to say that God painted the sky extra beautiful out here to make up for how hard the living was, Garrett said quietly. Josephine smiled. She sounds wise. She'd have liked you. He glanced at her, then quickly away. You have her practicality. Is that all I have? She found herself asking, surprising them both with her boldness. Garrett turned to her fully then, his eyes intense in the fading light. No. You have courage coming all this way on your own, intelligence, determination. His voice lowered. Beauty that has nothing to do with just your face. The compliment warmed her from within. Thank you. I'm not good with words like Thomas was, he continued, but I see you, Josephine. How you've taken to ranch life despite it being nothing like what you knew in Boston. How you treat everyone with kindness but stand your ground when needed. His hand moved slightly closer to hers on the porch railing. I'd be proud to have you as my wife, contract or no. Their fingers touched, just barely, and Josephine felt that strange flutter in her chest again, stronger now, undeniable. You're nothing like I expected, she admitted. Is that good or bad? Good, she whispered. Very good. The moment hung between them, fragile and precious, until a ranch hand called from the barn about a mare about to foal. Breaking the spell, Garrett reluctantly pulled away. I have to see to this. Would you like to come? It's a beautiful thing, new life coming into the world. She nodded, and that night they stood side by side in the warm stable as a new foal took its first wobbly steps, Garrett's arm occasionally brushing against hers, each touch sending sparks along her skin. The third week brought challenges. A neighboring rancher, Vernon Holden, rode onto the Quinn property with 3 armed men, claiming that Garrett had stolen cattle. Your brand looks mighty similar to mine these days, Quinn, Holden sneered, his hand resting too casually near his holstered pistol. Garrett stood his ground on the porch, his voice calm but steel beneath the surface. My brand's been registered for 20 years, Holden. If any cattle are missing their rightful home, they're mine, not yours. Josephine watched from the doorway, fear gripping her heart as the tension mounted. Holden's men spread out slightly, their postures threatening. Maybe we should check your north pasture, make sure none of my stock wandered over, Holden suggested with false pleasantness. You step 1 foot toward my north pasture without my permission, and the sheriff will be the next visitor you get, Garrett replied evenly. For a tense moment, Josephine thought violence would erupt on the very porch where she'd begun to feel at home. Then Holden spat into the dust. This isn't finished, Quinn. After they'd ridden off, Garrett turned to find Josephine white-faced in the doorway. I'm sorry you had to see that. Does this happen often? Holden's been trying to expand his holdings for years. He's not above stealing cattle or intimidation. Garrett's jaw was tight. With Thomas gone, he thinks I'm vulnerable. Are you? She asked softly. His eyes met hers. I was, not anymore. That night after dinner, Garrett asked Josephine to walk with him to the creek. The evening was mild, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above. They walked in companionable silence until reaching a large cottonwood tree that bent over the water. I used to come here with my mother, Garrett said, leaning against the trunk. She taught me to fish right in that pool there. Josephine smiled, trying to imagine him as a boy. You must miss her still. Every day. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Today, with Holden, I realized something. What's that? That having you here makes this place feel like home again, not just a ranch to work, but a home. The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. I've begun to feel that way too. Garrett took her hand then, his touch gentle but sure. Josephine, I know our arrangement started with a contract and practical considerations, but these weeks with you have been about much more than that for me. Her heart began to race. For me as well. The month isn't over yet, he said, but I don't need more time to know what I want. His fingers tightened slightly around hers. I want you to stay, not because of any arrangement, but because there's something growing between us that I hope you feel too. Josephine looked up at him, this man who had torn up a contract and offered something far more valuable in its place. I do feel it. Moonlight filtered through the branches above them as Garrett stepped closer, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. May I kiss you, Josephine? Not as part of any agreement, but because I want to, very much. She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion welling in her throat. His lips met hers softly at first, then with growing passion as she responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, and Josephine felt as though something long dormant within her had suddenly bloomed to life. When they finally parted, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. I think I'm falling in love with you, he whispered, and that wasn't in any contract. Tears pricked at her eyes, nor was me falling in love with you. His smile was tender as he brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Then perhaps we should make a different kind of agreement, one written not on paper but in our hearts. What kind of agreement? She asked. To build a life together. To face whatever comes good or bad side by side. To make this ranch a home for generations to come. I'd like that, she whispered. Very much. The following Sunday, they drove the wagon to town for services at the small white church that served Whitetail Creek. Afterward, Garrett introduced Josephine to everyone as his fiancée, his pride evident in every introduction. When's the wedding? Mrs. O'Malley asked as they stopped by the boarding house to collect the last of Josephine's things. 2 weeks from today, Garrett answered, his hand warm against the small of Josephine's back. Just a small ceremony at the ranch. Nothing small about joining two lives together, Mrs. O'Malley said wisely, but I'm happy for you both. Could see it coming a mile away when he rode in to fetch you himself that day. As they drove back to the ranch, the countryside golden in the late afternoon sun, Josephine leaned slightly against Garrett's shoulder. Did you know that first day that this is how it would be? He considered for a moment before answering. Not knew exactly, hoped maybe. He glanced down at her with a smile. You looked so proper and Eastern in your traveling clothes, clutching that satchel with your contract inside. I thought you might take one look at this rough country and run back to Boston on the next stage. I almost did, she admitted. When you tore up the contract, I was furious, terrified, really. I know. His arm slipped around her waist, but some things are worth more than any written guarantee. Like what? Like trust freely given, like knowing someone chooses you every day not because they're bound to, but because they want to. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Like love. The word hung in the air between them, no longer frightening but welcome, like coming home after a long journey. The night before their wedding, Holden and his men returned, this time setting fire to one of the outlying hay barns. Garrett and his hands managed to contain the blaze before it spread to other buildings, but the confrontation that followed nearly ended in bloodshed. Sheriff Miller from town, summoned by one of the ranch hands, arrived just in time. I've had enough of your accusations, Holden, the lawman said firmly. Quinn's brand is registered legal and proper, and I've got witnesses who saw your men near this property earlier today. Holden was arrested, his men dispersed, but the incident cast a shadow over what should have been a joyous time. We could postpone, Garrett offered as they sat on the porch later that night, the smell of smoke still lingering in the air. Josephine shook her head. No. I won't let Holden or anyone else delay our happiness. This is our home, and tomorrow we make it official. The pride and love in Garrett's eyes as he looked at her made any fear or doubt vanish like morning mist. You're a remarkable woman, Josephine Sinclair. Soon to be Josephine Quinn, she reminded him with a smile. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Lanterns and wildflowers decorated the yard between the house and the barn, where tables had been set up for the celebration afterward. The ranch hands had polished their boots and donned their Sunday best, and neighbors from miles around arrived in wagons and on horseback. Josephine wore a gown of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Hatcher had helped her alter, adding lace from her own wedding dress at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of prairie flowers tied with a blue ribbon that had belonged to Garrett's mother. As she walked from the house to where Garrett waited beside the minister, Josephine thought of the young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach just over a month ago, trembling and clutching a contract that she believed would secure her future. How little she had known then of what true security meant, not paper and ink, but the steadfast heart of a good man and the strength found in facing life's challenges together. Garrett's eyes never left her as she approached, his expression a mixture of awe and devotion that made her heart swell. When she reached him, he took her hands in his. "You are beautiful," he whispered, "inside and out." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows beneath the vast Montana sky, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett pulled her into a kiss that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire county. As darkness fell, lanterns cast a golden glow over the gathering, and Josephine found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the turn her life had taken. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" Garrett asked, finding her at the edge of the celebration watching the dancers. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "When I came west with that contract, I hoped for security, maybe companionship if I was fortunate. I never dreamed I would find love." He pulled her close, his arms strong around her. "When I tore up that contract, I was offering the only thing of real value I had, my heart. I'm thankful every day that you were brave enough to accept it. The bravest thing I ever did was step off that stagecoach," she said. "Everything good in my life came from that moment." Later that night, in the privacy of what was now their bedroom, Josephine and Garrett discovered a different kind of contract, one written not with ink, but with tender touches and passionate kisses, with whispered promises, and the joining of two bodies as completely as their hearts had already joined. Afterward, as she lay in his arms watching moonlight spill through the window, Josephine thought about the journey that had brought her here from destitution in Boston to this haven in Montana territory. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "How life rarely takes us where we expect, but sometimes, if we're very lucky, it takes us exactly where we need to be." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And are you where you need to be, Josephine Quinn?" She turned in his arms to face him, her heart full to overflowing. "I am home," she said simply, and she was. Over the years that followed, the Quinn Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Josephine brought Eastern business sense to complement Garrett's practical knowledge of the land. They expanded the horse breeding program, introduced new cattle breeds that thrived in the Montana climate, and built a reputation for fair dealings that spread throughout the territory. Their family grew as well, first with a daughter they named Margaret after Garrett's mother, then twin boys who had their father's blue eyes and their mother's determination. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family, but its heart remained the same, a place of love and acceptance, of hard work and shared dreams. Holden eventually sold his ranch and moved east, unable to overcome the damage to his reputation after his arrest. Other challenges came: droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns, and the changing face of the West as the frontier gradually disappeared. Through it all, Garrett and Josephine faced each obstacle together, their partnership stronger than any contract could have made it. On their 20th anniversary, they sat once again on the porch where they had first begun to know one another, watching their children tending to chores in the yard. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked suddenly. "Coming west, marrying a rough rancher instead of some city gentleman." Josephine looked at him with the same love that had only deepened over 2 decades. Not for a single moment. He reached for her hand, his touch still sending that same flutter through her heart after all these years. "I've been thinking about that contract you brought with you. Have you now?" She laughed. "I haven't thought of it in years." "Best thing I ever did was tear it up," he said firmly, "made room for something far better." And what was that? His eyes, still as blue as the Montana sky, held her steadily. "A love story written not on paper, but in our lives, day by day, year by year." Josephine squeezed his hand, thinking of the young woman with trembling hands who had traveled west with nothing but a contract and hope. How fortunate she had been to find a man who saw beyond the paper to the heart beneath, who had torn up an arrangement and offered instead a lifetime of love. "The best stories," she agreed, "are the ones we live, not the ones we plan." As the sun set over the ranch they had built together, Josephine rested her head on her husband's shoulder, thankful for contracts torn and hearts freely given, for the unexpected journey that had led her home.